Hello and good afternoon. Thank you for coming to my talk about getting started with Puppet on Windows. So here's a batch file to set up an external time source. It stops the time service, modifies the registry, starts the time service. Seems simple enough. Through my clever use of foreshadowing, you can probably tell that I have concerns about this approach. At a high level, we have scripts like this don't automate. If something goes wrong, if you're deploying this to a number of systems, how do you report on how many systems were successfully modified and which weren't? And how do you test changes like this before you roll out? And if we look at the script itself, it's making certain assumptions. Line 2 will actually fail if the service is already stopped. If the external time sources are already configured correctly, we're going to restart the service unnecessarily. So surely we can do better. And that's what today is about. So my name is Josh Cooper. I'm a principal software engineer at Puppet Labs and have been leading our Windows development for about 3 years. I'm a member of the platform team responsible for open source projects, a frequent contributor to Puppet, and I wrote the PowerShell and Reboot modules. So today I'm going to talk about how Puppet automates Windows configuration management. Perhaps you're new to Puppet, or you're using Puppet on other platforms, and you want to understand how to apply what you know, what you've learned on other platforms, and take that and apply it to Windows. So I'll cover just briefly what is Puppet, getting started, and effectively managing Windows with Puppet. So have you guys seen this slide before? Is this new? OK, looks new. OK, so what is Puppet? Puppet is designed to automate the configuration and ongoing maintenance of your systems. In a nutshell, this diagram is showing you, number one there is, first you define the desired state of your systems using Puppet's declarative language. Step 2, you can simulate configuration changes, making sure that what you've declared is what you expect. And at step 3, you can put Puppet in its normal enforcing mode, and it will ensure that the current state matches whatever desired state you specified. And step 4 is Puppet always reports on whatever changes it makes, so you have an audit trail about what happened. In the Puppet ecosystem, there are a number of other components, things like the Puppet Master, Puppet DB, the console. And today I'm just going to be focusing on the Puppet agent as it applies to Windows. So we talk about puppetizing things. And what we mean is we take a resource that is not managed by Puppet and we put it under Puppet's management. This is an example of that batch script earlier expressed in Puppet. So we have a registry value and we have a service. And basically you declare these resources in a manifest, and that's what Puppet consumes. And the important thing is to notice that we're only declaring the desired state without mentioning how to make that happen. So it doesn't matter what state the system is currently in, Puppet will put it in that state. And so we're just going to go through this manifest in a little bit more detail to help you, to help get the right mental model for how Puppet works. So we have a registry value. And you can see that this is a resource in Puppet terminology. It is a type of resource, registry value. The title of the resource, HKey local machine, and so on, is the path to that registry value. And in Puppet, we're saying that we want to ensure that that registry value is present. It's of type array, which maps to the registry reg array. And it has the specified values in that order. So now this is a resource, this is a service resource, a different type of resource for managing the Windows time service. One thing to note, Puppet always uses the short name for service names, not the display name. So here we're saying we want to ensure that that service is running and that it's enabled true, which means that it's an automatic service. Now, the one part I haven't talked about is the relationship, which you might have seen in the couple of slides ago. And here we're basically saying that these two resources are related. And the way this works is the registry value notifies the time service. So what we're saying is we want the registry value to be evaluated first. And if that registry value changes, it should notify the service, causing the service to restart. One really important property is that Puppet will do nothing if the service and registry are already in the desired state, right? So we're not restarting services unnecessarily. And this is a really important property for a configuration management system to have. Only make changes when changes are actually necessary. So we've puppetized a simple example. And so we have a mental model for what Puppet resources are and how you create relationships between them. So how do we apply that to Windows? And so I'm going to talk about supported platforms, just installing Puppet on the agent, Puppet applications that you can run, and various types of Puppet resources, like registry value service. So Puppet currently supports 2003 and up, and Windows Vista and up on the consumer platforms. 2003 will be EOL in July of next year, and I personally couldn't be more happy about that. All right, so let's install Puppet. That's actually pretty simple to do. So we post all of our MSIs on our website. So you can go to downloads.puppetlabs.com/windows. We have all our MSIs there. This is a PowerShell script to download that and execute it and block until it's completed. One thing to note, our MSI contains, so Puppet runs on Ruby, and our MSI contains the Ruby runtime and all the dependencies that you need. So there's no additional software required. There's no Cygwin or MSys or anything like that. Puppet installation is pretty simple. It doesn't require a reboot. Puppet will install itself by default as a service running in the background, and will periodically fetch configurations from the Puppet master and apply them to the local system. So we also, as you can see, we support a number of MSI properties to configure that behavior. You can specify the Puppet master server. You can specify the startup type for the service. So you can maybe you only want it to be a manual service type. And you can configure the user that the service runs as. If you do specify that, Puppet will automatically add that user to the local administrators group. OK, so we just downloaded something from the internet, installed it on your system. It's running as local system on your box. What could go wrong? So we take security seriously at Puppet Labs. We digitally sign all of our MSIs with an Authenticode certificate issued by Thought to ensure that the contents of that package haven't been modified since it was published. One new thing that we've added in Puppet 3.7, and I'll talk about this in a little more detail, our Puppet MSI historically has run in a 32-bit Ruby process, and that creates problems when you're trying to manage a 64-bit operating system due to file system redirection and all of that good stuff. So recently, we've added support for 64-bit Ruby. And if you want to deploy that version, make sure you install the x64 version of the MSI from our website. And this just shows Process Explorer showing Puppet running as a 64-bit process. OK, so we've installed Puppet. We didn't need to install a database. We didn't need to install a .NET version, whatever. We didn't need to reboot the system. So now that Puppet's installed, we can start doing things with it and have Puppet tell us about our system and making changes, which is pretty cool. So there's three main modes that I'm going to go through. One is Puppet resource. This is an application you can run on the command line. Apply is another command line application, and agent. So first, Puppet resource. This is a pretty cool thing about Puppet that I like. And the idea is Puppet can both ensure your system is in the desired state, but it can also tell you about your system. So here on the first command, I'm running Puppet resource service W32 time, and Puppet is telling me about the current state of my service in Puppet's own language. And in this particular case, it's telling me that the service startup type is manual. So using that same application, I can then run it again and say enable equal true and change it to an automatic service. And Puppet, when I run that, Puppet shows me, hey, I changed that one particular property of that service, changed from manual to true, and it tells me what it then produced. And this is really helpful for getting started with Puppet because you can learn a lot about Puppet's language this way. It's self-documenting in that regard. So packages. This is another type of resource that Puppet supports. In addition to using Puppet resource to tell you about a single resource, you can ask Puppet to tell you about all instances of a particular type of resource. So here, I'm saying Puppet resource package, tell me about all the packages you know about. And this is looking at basically what add remove programs would tell you, including version numbers. And all this information comes from the registry, which has its limitations. So Puppet apply. So we talked about resource, and that's great for single resources. Puppet apply is how do you take a collection of resources and relationships, and how do you apply them on the system? I don't know if you just saw Eric Dahlin's Spotify talk. They actually run Puppet masterless, so they run everything through Puppet apply. But most people don't usually do that. It's some assembly is required kind of thing. So yeah, so in this example, I have Puppet apply. I'll talk about no op. Puppet apply service.pp. By default, Puppet manifests, which are text files that contain the declarative state of what you want. They end in .pp. That's by convention. And here I'm running Puppet apply and specifying --no-op, and this is, tell me, Puppet, what would you do, but don't actually make any changes. So here you can see it's saying, well, the current value is stopped, and it should be running, but it's no-op, so I'm not going to actually do anything. And that's, at the very beginning we talked about the loop, right? And this is how you can test out your manifests. You can iterate on them and make sure that it's actually doing the thing that you expect it to. Okay, so Puppet agent. And this is the typical way that Puppet runs, in a production environment. This is an application that can either run in the foreground, so you can run an on-demand Puppet agent run, or it runs in the background by default every 30 minutes. That can be configured. It runs in the background as a Windows service, as we talked about earlier. And basically, the workflow is we have a node here, which is a Windows node, and it runs and it collects information about itself, and we call those things facts. So it's things like, what's my operating system version? What's my path environment variable? Various information. It sends up to the Puppet master, and it requests a catalog. And the Puppet master says, OK, I'm going to take your facts, and I'm going to take everything I know about the desired state, and I'm going to compile a catalog, and I'm going to return the catalog to the node. The node then applies that desired state to the system, brings it into compliance, sends a report to the Puppet master, and says, these are all the changes I made. Typically, those reports go into PuppetDB, where you have a historical, well, sorry, not a historical record. You have a record of what has happened. For example, you can query PuppetDB and get information about your population. How many versions of Windows 5.2 do I have, or various things like that. And if you want to understand more about how Puppet itself on Windows fits into the Puppet ecosystem, I recommend attending one of the demos if you haven't already, managing Windows with Puppet Enterprise in the Yerba Buena level later today. OK, so resources. We've seen some examples of service and registry resources. There's a number of core resources that you can manage with Puppet as soon as you install it. There's a number of additional resource types that are supported by Puppet Labs, and we'll talk about what that means. There's also a number of community modules where people have, contributed lots of great management capabilities there. And a module, just in Puppet terminology, a module is something, it's a Puppet, it's our packaging format, so it allows you to distribute. If you write a new thing for managing, certificates on Windows, you could package that up into a module and publish it to our Forge. And then I'm also going to talk about tooling that's available for writing manifests. Okay, core resources. So these are things you can manage with Puppet as soon as you install it. So exec is for things like batch files and executables. File is for managing file directory symlinks where available. User and group are basically managing local accounts. So you can add domain accounts as members of a local administrators group, for example. The package resource type is for managing MSIs and executable-based installers. And as you know, Windows doesn't have a real packaging management system, and this is where Chocolatey comes in. And there's a Chocolatey package provider for managing Chocolatey packages. And I strongly encourage you to look at that if you haven't already. And also, I hope you saw Rob Reynolds' talk yesterday on this topic. If you haven't, look online for when the talks become available. You'll definitely want to check that out. And then finally, we talked about service and host. We talked about the service resource, and host and scheduled task are for what you'd expect, managing the host file and managing scheduled tasks. Okay, so supported modules. So Puppet has a number of supported modules, which means that they're tested, maintained, and subject to Puppet Enterprise support. So if you have a problem with them, you can call if you have a support contract, you can call Puppet Labs and get issues resolved. The modules on the left are Windows specific, and the ones on the right are things that are just generally used across all of our supported platforms. So we have ACL, which is for managing Windows security descriptors in all of its gory detail. It's very comprehensive. Anything about a security descriptor you want to specify, you can do that. The PowerShell module is, just actually one note there. So I originally wrote the PowerShell module. It has since become a Puppet Labs supported module. You'll want to use the Puppet Labs supported module from now on. I'll be deprecating the one that I wrote because the Puppet Labs one has changes in it to enable support for x64 that the version that I have published under my name to the Forge does not have. So basically, the PowerShell module makes it really easy to execute PowerShell code in Puppet. You can literally drop PowerShell code into Puppet and have it execute it without having to reformat it or escape $signs or any of that craziness. And so the reboot module it's really helpful if you have to sequence an application install, you need to install something, reboot, install something else. And finally, the registry module, which we've been talking about. There's also last time I looked, nearly 100 Windows modules on the Forge. And at least 6 months ago, Windows was the top search term on the Forge. So the Forge is basically a website you can go to. It gives you a view of all of our modules that people have contributed, and instructions for how to use them, how to get started, that sort of thing. I have a link here to sort based on download counts, so you can get an idea of things that other people are actually using. And I wanted to recognize some people in the community that have made some really great contributions to the Forge. First, Paul Stack and Liam Bennett from OpenTable. They've published a number of high-quality modules to the Forge. Recommend that you take a look at those. Rich Siegel is a longtime Puppet user. He's also the author of the Chocolatey package provider. And he has a whole suite of modules. I definitely recommend looking at that. And finally, I wanted to mention Mark Sutter, who just recently contributed a module for managing DSC resources from within Puppet. And it's pretty interesting, and I recommend taking a look at that as well. So we have these modules on the Forge, and you have Puppet running on your Windows box. So how do you get the module that you need to manage the registry? And this is what this slide is showing. I'm running Puppet module, which is another application. And I'm running Puppet module install Puppet Labs registry, contacts the Forge, pulls it down. And it also, you can see that registry has a dependency on standard lib. And it automatically resolves that dependency and installs it as well. Now, normally, when you're using Puppet agent, the way things work is you install modules on your Puppet master, and as part of the normal Puppet agent run, it'll pull down modules from the master. It'll pull down a catalog and all the code, basically the data and the code that it needs to run. And but when you're running Puppet apply and you're developing and writing your own modules, for example, you're going to need those things locally. And so that's why I'm running Puppet module, installing a module on my Windows box so that we can run Puppet apply. OK. So we've talked about resources. We've talked about different modules that are out there to help you manage new types of things about your Windows box. And now, so how do you write a manifest that describes the desired state of these resources? If you're new to Puppet, Puppet has its own declarative language. Sometimes that can be, it's a new language, so it takes a little time to get used to the language and how it works and the syntax for it. So this screenshot here is of Geppetto, which is a Puppet Labs product. It's an Eclipse-based IDE for writing manifests. It does full syntax highlighting and validation. I don't know if you saw Henrik Lindberg's talk yesterday about the Puppet 4 language. He wrote the language that's used in Geppetto, all the parsing that's in Geppetto. He knows, he understands Puppet language very well. So it's a really good product to try to use if you don't have, if you're not a Vim or Emacs or Sublime or TextMate user and you want something else. Also wanted to note that in April, our founder, Luke Knies, keynoted at Build 2014. It was actually on day 2, if you're looking for the video for that. And Luke and Mark Rusinovich deployed sysinternals using the manifest shown here. This is a Visual Studio plugin that allows you to create Puppet modules and publish to the Forge all within Visual Studio. There's a link there. I had to shorten it because it was really long. All right. So some people, when they start out and they've deployed, so they have Puppet agent, now they want to run Puppet apply, but wait, they need a Puppet master, right? So where do you get a Puppet master? So one way to do that is to go to Azure. And you can go to portal.azure.com. You can go to the Azure gallery, and you can install Puppet Enterprise on, it's basically a pre-configured image. It's an Ubuntu 12.04 LTS image. And you can see I've entered 3 pieces of information: my hostname, my username, and my SSH public key. And you hit next, and you have Puppet Enterprise running in Azure. There's also a related workflow in Azure that I'm not showing that is for any Windows VM you deploy in Azure. There's essentially a checkbox that says, include a Puppet Enterprise agent on that VM. And as part of the Azure deployment provisioning, it'll start up and it has Puppet Enterprise agent running on it. And the only thing you need to specify there is the Puppet Master FQDN to connect to. So that's kind of a cool way to get started and try out Puppet. OK, so we've talked about installing Puppet on Windows, different types of resources. We have modules and various tools to actually get started. But how do you write a manifest that interacts with Windows in a way that you would expect? So that's sort of the next section of the talk. The first thing that people usually run into is quotes and interpolation. So this is a little snippet that shows replacing the task manager with Process Explorer. This is only the registry value part. It assumes that Process Explorer is already on the system. You can see the first line is, I'm taking a long string here, and this is a registry path, and I'm single quoting it, and I'm storing that, basically assigning that to a variable, task manager. And note, I'm using single quotes, and I'm using single backslashes. And this is generally preferred in the sense that single quotes are safer and easier to use. So safer because single quotes disable variable interpolation. And it's easier because in a single quoted string, you only need to use single backslashes. But there are times when you do need to interpolate a variable. And then in that case, you are required to use double quoted strings. And that's what registry value, the title of the registry value resource is, task manager, double backslash, debugger. So as soon as you double quote a string, you have to escape backslashes. Hopefully that makes sense. Windows accounts. So Windows accounts can come in various forms, and Puppet accepts all of these forms. We can manage a local administrators group. We can ensure it's present. We can ensure that its members are the administrator account using the short name. We can ensure that it includes the local service account using a SID. And we can specify the network service account as a domain qualified account. And internally, Puppet always uses the SID when comparing accounts to make sure that they're equal. And case sensitivity is something that we all have to deal with, unfortunately. And most Windows resources are case insensitive but case preserving. Just the thing for Puppet is make sure that you're consistent in whatever you use. So in this case, I have a package resource that has a before relationship on the service. So you can see Jenkins slave shows up in two places. Make sure that that case is consistent so that Puppet can map the relationship correctly. So earlier I mentioned the 64-bit version of Ruby and file system redirection and all of that. And this is about the Windows 32-bit on Windows 64 subsystem, which Microsoft calls WoW, and I call YOY. This has caused so many problems for us, for users. It's probably the #1 question we get on the mailing lists, or things just not working right. And so the reason is, if you're running a 32-bit Ruby process, like how prior to Puppet 3.7, due to file system redirection, these two resources are actually different. So when a 32-bit process tries to access system32, they're redirected to a special directory for 32-bit executables and DLLs, while sysnative is not. And sysnative is basically a way to escape file system redirection. This causes a lot of problems for things like people trying to write custom facts, or external executable facts. So if you're trying to write PowerShell fact, and that fact will actually execute the 32-bit version of PowerShell when you're running on a 64-bit version of Windows, which can mean that certain features are not available. There's a different module path, all kinds of fun stuff. So in Puppet 3.7, we've added support for 64-bit Ruby. And there's two installers, as I mentioned. If you run the 64-bit version of Puppet, the first file resource there to system32 is going to do what you would expect. It's going to manage the native I have to be careful with native there. It's what you would expect the system32 directory. But when you're running in 64-bit version of Puppet, the second file resource is not valid because the sysnative alias doesn't exist. So if you're writing a manifest, you have to be careful about knowing which Ruby architectures your resources will be running on. Eventually, the 64-bit platform is going to become the de facto one. And especially as 2003 becomes end of life and the 64-bit platform, the Ruby MSI becomes more stable. Okay, so UAC is sort of like sudo-ish. A process may be running with elevated privileges or not. For example, I'm showing the process on the top is running with privileges, while the process on the bottom, running as the same user, is not. And I can tell that, aside from looking at the title bar, is because the bottom process has a deny only administrator, SID, and the process token. And this is important when it comes to Puppet because it almost always needs to be running with elevated privileges. If you're not running with elevated privileges, then some bad things can happen. Not bad things, it's just, it's another pitfall that you can fall into. So when Puppet is running elevated, it's running in a machine context, right? You're managing the machine. And all of its data is stored in a common machine location. So this slide here is telling me that if I say Puppet agent config print confdir, I'm asking Puppet, where's your configuration data stored? And it's telling me it's in program data, Puppet labs, etc. And on 2003, this is actually under documents and settings, all users, application data, and so on. The process on the bottom is not elevated, and Puppet is running in a user context here, and that's why all of its data is stored in .puppet within the user's home directory. So the trap that some people fall into is that when you install Puppet, the service is running as an automatic service in the background, running as local system, so it's elevated. A common problem occurs if you run Puppet agent from the command line in a non-elevated context. Doing so essentially causes two different agents to try to connect to the Puppet master, and that can cause certificate problems because the Puppet master is expecting there only to be one instance of that agent with that name on the system. So the key point is make sure you're running with elevated privileges when you're running Puppet agent. So Puppet was originally designed for managing Unix-based operating systems. Over the last several years, we've worked really hard to bring Puppet to Windows to have equal parity with other platforms. At Puppet Labs, we've hired a number of people with Windows expertise. We've created a continuous integration system to test extensively on Windows, both the platform and also module content. And we've also built a healthy community of Windows users and module content on the Forge. And that's where you guys come in. If you haven't already, I recommend trying out and deploying Puppet on Windows. Ask questions, join our community, improve the modules. If you see a problem, submit a pull request. Basically, help make the Puppet ecosystem better. So next steps, where to go from here. I recommend reading our documentation, docs.puppetlabs.com/windows. We've just added a training course specifically designed for Windows. You can go to our website under training and look for more details about that. We also have Google groups, Puppet users and Puppet dev. If you're starting out, I recommend starting on the Puppet users group. You know, if you're writing your own manifest, trying to use a particular module, that sort of thing. Puppet dev list is more about I'm writing a new type and provider, or I'm trying to make a change to Puppet itself and need help with that part. But we welcome people at all levels. There's also ask.puppetlabs.com, so you can ask a question, get answers pretty quickly from community members, even Puppet Labs employees. And tickets.puppetlabs.com is our ticket tracking system. The one thing I would recommend, please do search Google before you file a new ticket or ask a new question. All of these sites are indexed. There's a great historical record, obviously, Google Groups. And last, I would recommend Ethan Brown is giving a workshop immediately following this talk. And he's going to be talking, the talk is Puppet for Windows users, and showing application deployment, basically a real world scenario of how you take what we've talked about here and how do you actually build up something much more complex. Finally, do you speak Windows? If so, we'd love to talk to you. And thank you for coming. And I'm happy to take any questions people have. Thank you. Yep.
What's the roadmap look like down the road for Windows support? What other enhancements might Puppet be doing outside the
Yep, so the question is, what does the Puppet roadmap look like for Puppet on Windows? And the platform itself has stabilized quite a bit. We have a lot of Fortune 100 companies running Puppet on Windows. A lot of the next step is about building better content. So, there's certain application workflow scenarios that we want to make very easy. So things like you want to make sure that Windows Update service is running, configured, pointing to the right local WSUS server, has the right frequency, that sort of thing. Also, setting up a domain, making sure the domain controller is configured correctly, making sure machines are joined to the domain. So building out those workflows. Question in the back?
Yes. One of your slides you're talking about.
Oh, sorry, there's a microphone coming.
All right. You had a slide that was one of the manifests was defining, I think, like a package, making sure it was installed, and also had ensure version 1 dot whatever. It was actually something else, but is that a way that you could also maybe upgrade packages? Say for instance, you could change that ensure version to be a higher version. If the agent checked in, would it then apply the higher version of the package?
Yes. So this one here.
Yes, sir.
Yep. So by default, Puppet has a Windows package provider, which is what this is showing. And the Windows package provider is versionable and upgradable. So you can specify a particular version of Chrome, for example, to be installed. The one thing you have to be careful of is that the version you specify as ensure needs to match what the source that if you're pointing it at an MSI. So let me explain that a little better. So normally you have a package resource, it has a title, you have an ensure version, and then you have a source parameter that tells the package provider where to go install that MSI from. And that can be a local path or a UNC path. And so, yeah, I could bump that ensure version, but you just have to make sure that that version you specify corresponds to the source that you're also pointing at. Otherwise, Puppet can keep thinking the resource is out of sync and try to reinstall it. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
OK. Question here?
I have a question about the native port to Windows. Could you talk about the time frame and what that's going to look like and what runtime you're going to use, if you decided?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand that.
Well, the runtime, are you going to use the Microsoft runtime or Cygwin or whatever?
OK, so the question is about the runtime. Basically, we right now run on Ruby. That's our platform. And we include all the dependencies in there, all the gems that we require. But at the end of the day, we're basically making Win32 API calls to manage everything. So we're not dependent on a particular .NET version.
Following that up, I think he was talking about the native port that's coming.
Oh, sorry. So, OK, yeah, right. So C factor, is that what you're talking about? Like C++ on the agent? All right. So yeah, C factor is already in the works for a Puppet version a Puppet on Windows version. And yeah, definitely having a native agent is something we're looking at also on Windows. Question in the back? Or,
I have one that relates to the previous question about the packages and the MSIs.
Uh-huh.
In some instances, specifically for Microsoft software, they don't release an MSI, they release an MSP.
uh-huh.
Is there support for that? If there's not, will there be support for that in the future release?
Something we're looking at very soon.
Okay. Do you have
Yeah, we don't currently support that. You could install it as an exec.
That's what I've had to do so far. I've
Yep.
been trying to avoid that.
But we're looking at adding that to the package resource type.
Okay. Do they have a version in mind for when that's going to be out, or
Soonish,
soonish? Okay.
early
Works.
next year. Time.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Question over here. Actually, one on the back and then right here. Sorry.
Okay. Can you configure the Puppet to point as the WSUS or the Windows Configuration Manager as a repo type server?
For automatic updates specifically?
For automatic updates, Configuration Manager will also do custom package installation.
Yeah, at the end of the day, that's going to be a registry setting. I know automatic updates, there's a module on the Forge, actually by Liam Bennett that I mentioned earlier, for managing, he's over there, for pointing your Windows update at your local server. Okay, I think, are we? Yep. One? Okay, one more question.
Currently, is there any other package distribution platform other than Chocolatey available?
Not that I know of. Well, OneGet. Yeah, no. Rob can answer this question better than I can.
There's something called ImpactD, but it's actually pronounced unpacked. So that's your alternative to Chocolatey.
All right, I think we're out of time. I'll be happy to answer questions. I'll be right over here at the end of the talk. Thank you.